cognizant of trying to start as close to on time as possible. Thanks for coming out. If you are here for Constitution Day, then stick around because we've got some great stuff going on here. If not, this is your last chance to get off and fly to wherever else you're going. My name is Christopher McKnight-Nichols. I'm a historian here at OSU. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of helping to organize our Constitution Day events. I'm also the director of the OSU Center for the Humanities, which is down on 8th and Jefferson. Come visit us. We have amazing programs. The humanities are fantastic at Oregon State. And slightly hidden gem that I want to show off more to the world if possible. I also have the pleasure of helping to direct our Citizenship and Crisis Initiative here at OSU, which helps to sponsor this series. We've got some materials in back, which is co-sponsored by the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, which has some classes and other kinds of events that tie in nicely to the themes of today, particularly our surveys in the historical sequence 201, 202, and 203, which is sort of the main series of surveys related to this. So if you're a student and you're looking for a class, don't see a lot of student faces today. Classes aren't in session. Come on out for 201, 202, and 203. And then my colleagues in political science also have fantastic classes along those lines that would match up with some of our themes. Okay, so I also always begin our events with some mundane details. One, not so mundane one, is we've got lots of great food and drink out there, courtesy of the OSU Office of Academic Affairs, which is helping sponsor this event. So thanks to them, please grab some food and drink. Second, mundane detail, which I always do, phones, please silence them. I always say this, some version of this. In fact, today, in a faculty meeting, faculty you should know better, had phones ringing regularly. Right? We always tell our students not to do this, and yet we do it to ourselves, so please help us out, or help yourself out. Silence devices. All right, third, if you want to leave early, that's entirely fine by us. Come be edified for as long as possible and then head out. But please leave surreptitiously, quietly, all that good stuff. All right, and fourth, in terms of timing and format, each of these really distinguished folks only has 8 to 12 minutes to enlighten you about the presidency and the Constitution. So we're really aiming at sort of provocative, brief kinds of comments that will help spur our collective thought. Because one of the points of this event is that it's about a community conversation as much as it is about expert opinion and information. It's about dialogue. So they'll each have sort of 8 to 12 minutes. I'll try to push them pretty hard to not go too long. And we'll end this at 5:30. But we have the room till 6, so if people want to linger and talk more, that is part of the point of this too, so feel free to do so. All right, so I've thanked the Office of Academic Affairs, I've thanked the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, I've thanked the Citizenship and Crisis Initiative, I've thanked the Center for the Humanities, and I'm done acknowledging people. But I should certainly acknowledge this great panel, and I'll introduce each of them before they go, sort of in turn. But thanks so much to each of you for coming out, and special thanks to University Day speaker Harry Boyte, who's here with us, kindly giving it another talk and another series of events. So thanks so much for coming, Harry. All right, having dispensed with all that, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. You may wonder, those of you who haven't been to a Constitution Day event, what is Constitution Day? Why are we even here? Well, of course, there is the Constitution, and there's the latent interest that's clearly demonstrated by your being here. But what is it? Well, all educational institutions in the U.S. that receive federal funds are required by law to hold an educational program pertaining to the U.S. Constitution. Institutions vary in how seriously they take this. Some simply hand out copies of the Constitution and consider that it. And others, like us, are privileged enough to do pretty serious programming to help our community, Corvallis, Oregon State, Oregon, and beyond think deeply about the kinds of questions raised by the Constitution. So on this day, more or less, actually yesterday, but it was a Sunday, September 17th, 1787, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you all know how the story goes, 39 people signed the Constitution, and they helped to change the course of history. Those people, those actions, those related events, those ideas, their consequences, good and bad, are why we're here today. Of course, there were 55 or so people there, so something like 16 didn't sign. They actually objected to the Constitution. Worth remembering that when people talk about the Founding Fathers and their unanimity. There was not very much of that. And if you'd been there in the summer of 1787, one of our experts here could talk to that, it was quite contentious at various moments. Not unlike 2017 and American democracy. days honoring citizenship and the Constitution actually go back quite a ways, and it's worth thinking just for a moment about why this day even exists, for better and for worse. They go back in various cities and states. Historians track them to 1911. There's some scholars who say that these were pretty popular in the 19th century. And changes in this specific day of celebration track neatly with major conflicts. So if you want to think about why and when Americans think about the Constitution, it often has to do with conflicts abroad, which I think is salient for us today as well. So the first widely observed series of events of this type came in 1939 in the form of a third Sunday, I Am an American Day. This came by a joint resolution of Congress that was enacted in 1940. So a sort of hyper-patriotic wartime celebration throughout the war years. It was followed in the late 40s and into the early 50s with similar sorts of events that were sort of staunchly anti-communist, filling kind of domestic political vacuum with a kind of hyper-patriotic sense of what is the Constitution, who's included and who's excluded domestically and internationally. State-level proclamations were where this really happened a lot, and so historians who've looked at this say that that's where the real action was in conflicts of the early Cold War, in trying to make people think deeply about the Constitution in a kind of exclusive way. The state legislators, mostly state legislatures and governors, made September 17th, quote, I Am an American Day, between 1949 and 1952 in almost every state. They softened this language a little bit, and by 1952 it became Citizenship Day, not I Am an American Day, by a proclamation of Harry Truman. Not to be outdone, Dwight Eisenhower then picked up the ball and decided to make it a whole week. He called the week the first Constitution Week, and it was September 17th to 25th, which he proclaimed in 1955. This remained for the whole rest of about the next half century until Bill Clinton came around, tried to soften the language again with a less exclusive kind of way of thinking about this, and he called it Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. Changed it from a week to just a day, but a day of many things. And then that act was amended by Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia and signed into law by George Bush in 2005, which has the current mandate, which is that all publicly funded educational institutions and federal agencies have to provide some educational programming about this day. So once a year then, what's our official purpose? It is, quote, recognizing and celebrating the origin and purposes of the Constitution. It isn't necessarily triumphalist, but it could be. It isn't necessarily declensionist, but it also could be. So that's up to us in our community conversation to think about. So today's theme is the hot button issue of the presidency and the Constitution. And we've got all kinds of issues to discuss. Some that we laid out in our promotions were things that the committee that was talking about this when we decided on the topic came up with. Questions that we were discussing, some of our animated questions were, what powers does the Constitution invest in the president? According to the Constitution, what is the role of the president? Is there a single role, multiple roles? What are the limits of the presidency according to the Constitution and precedent? How has the relationship between the presidency and the Constitution changed over time? Where might it be headed today? What's the relationship between the president, the citizenry, and the Constitution? How about those who aren't necessarily citizens? How do they fit into this mix? All kinds of other constitutional issues have come up. When we were emailing about this, it was hard to decide even how to focus. Emoluments, immunity, pardon power, right? We could go on, and the current presidency, almost every day or week, has brought up another question. There's a great podcast called Con Law, Trump Con Law, about learning constitutional law through President Trump. There are a whole bunch of these. Constitutional is another one, if you want to learn about these. So these kinds of issues that are raised, thought experiments, that there's no precedent in law about. Does a tweet count as a pardon? Is one new open question in American democracy. If you say, I pardon Rory Solberg by tweet, you can't take it back, it would seem, but there's no precedent and no constitutional law related to this. And there are a lot more and more complicated and important kinds of questions for us to discuss. So one of the things we'll be focusing on, but not exclusively, is what we passed around, which is Article 2. This is what lays out, but in no way fully details, the constitutional roles of the president. What I thought I would do just here right before I introduce everybody is kind of get at least that part out, so we have that as a foundation for our discussion, and then they can provoke our thought in various ways from there. So as the National Constitution Center likes to say about Article 2, there's at least 8 presidential roles laid out just there. They are Chief of State, Chief Executive, Chief Administrator, Chief Diplomat, Commander-in-Chief, Chief Legislator, Party Chief, and Chief Citizen. All right, so Chief of State, Chief Executive, Chief Administrator, Chief Diplomat, Commander-in-Chief, Chief Legislator, 6, Party Chief, 7, and Chief Citizen, 8. A lot of chiefdom there, right? But that comes literally from the section, from Article 2. So Chief of State is one that I just wanted to highlight for us, which I think is slightly interesting in historical perspective as well. Refers to the president as the head of the government. And in this way, it's sort of in keeping with democratic principles and sort of pragmatic political concerns. And that is, from the founding era onward, the individual president serves as a kind of personification of the democratic republic, for better and for worse, as a symbol of the American people. Now this sounds maybe good or bad, depending on your perspective in the present or in the near past in different presidencies. But it's important to think about that in its historical context to recognize what a departure that is from other existing political systems in the past, right? So if you're thinking about a monarch or a tyrant or another form of government, were they a symbol of their people? Were they a symbol of the sort of structure of government? Or were they, in fact, as those systems were thought of, divinely appointed, or coming through a hereditary lineage, or through simple use of power, hard power, assuming power, right? This is actually quite a departure from the existing systems in the 1780s to have a president who was a symbol of the people rather than sort of a more direct monarchical kind of figure leading the people. For better and for worse, again, we might say. All right, so Article 2. Quickly, briefly, what's it say as we jump into our analysis of the presidency and the Constitution? All right, Section 1 begins, the executive power, you can see it there on the sheets that we handed out. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during a term of 4 years, and together with the vice president, chosen for the same term. All right, that's called the vesting clause, or it's the beginning of the vesting clause. In short, this section establishes the president and vice president being elected at the same time for 4 years, and the mechanisms have changed a lot over time. We also learn in this section that rather than being directly elected, the president is elected by members of the Electoral College. We had a great program last year in the Electoral College, so go to our website to learn more about that and how that's changed over time, the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion's YouTube website. But of course, this group of people are to be elected by the states, right? Electors who elect the president. Their combined numbers are to be equal to that of the representatives and senators in Congress. And this is a compromise, classic compromise of the Constitutional Convention. Big states, small states, the 3/5 clause, there's a lot going on to unpack within just thinking about the Electoral College and how representatives are apportioned. We also learn in this section that neither members of Congress nor federal officials may serve as electors. This is something that comes up a lot when we talk about this. Who can be an elector? Who are the electors? Do you even know them, right? What's the importance of this? And in some ways, it's often thought of as a creation that gives more power to small states than large states. So we can talk more about that later. Additional rules have been added by amendment after amendment. I won't go on about those, but one is the 12th, which, for example, creates the way a president is selected when neither candidate obtains a majority of votes in the Electoral College. Right, so this wasn't yet fully foreseen in the Compromise of 1787, and so you wind up having to have these amendments, right? So the Constitution, as a living document in this sense, is really critical to understand. All right, I'll keep running through some of these. There's a lot more to talk about. I just want to set a little foundation. All right, Article 2, Section 2 begins, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service. So here we learn what we learn about the powers of the President, including those chiefdoms, some of them. And you get two key clauses here, which Rory Solberg and others maybe can help us analyze. The appointment power, one of the most important presidential powers, is located here. And is also somewhat contested, particularly these days, and the Commander-in-Chief clause. The President serves not only as the head of the executive branch here, but also Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services. As Chief Executive, here's another of those chiefdoms, right? The President runs the different executive agencies and can hire and fire those folks, or at least that's the presumption of how this operates. That's things like the Department of the Treasury, Department of Health and Human Services. And the president has the power, here it is, to pardon, let free, any person who's committed a federal crime. So the jurisdiction is just federal, except in cases of impeachment. Can the president pardon himself? A now imponderable question that we are pondering. With permission of 2/3 of the Senate, the president can make formal treaties. So this is another crucial part of thinking about what are the powers invested in the president. And with approval of a majority of senators through advice and consent, the president can make key appointments. So you get all that there. All right, quickly laying out the rest. Article 2, Section 3 really details some of the key duties. During his or her term, the president must report to Congress. That's the State of the Union. There's an interesting history to that. Usually it was issued in a letter form. Then much later, it's not until Woodrow Wilson, the 20th century, that you get the addresses that we think of as States of the Union. Now it's so pro forma. Every president has to give these, and they have to make them big events, big media events. And the president has the power to call the House and Senate into session. There's some interesting dynamics to that we might talk about today. All right, one last one, maybe the hottest one, maybe for this audience is most concerned. When you get to Article 2, Section 4, you get to what a lot of people have been talking about since January, or maybe since November. The impeachment process. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And we can parse this more as we go, but this way the Constitution provides that the president, vice president, and other federal officers can be removed from office upon impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate of treason or bribery. The historical note, very quickly, is it's only happened 3 times. Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, though he resigned before articles of impeachment went all the way through, and Bill Clinton. So we actually don't have that much precedent there either. And that's worth noting as we launch into our discussion. All right, so those are some of our foundational concepts. And I apologize for going rather rapidly. So first up, I will introduce each of our speakers, and we will run through some of the most important questions in American democracy and Constitution these days. All right, so Associate Professor of Political Science in the School of Public Policy is Rory Solberg. She's a scholar of judicial politics and judicial behavior. So she's our law expert, more or less, on this panel. She's widely published in scholarly journals, such as the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, Social Science Quarterly, Policy Studies Journal, Political Research Quarterly, Justice Systems Journal. Her most recent book, co-authored with Eric Waldenberg, The Media, the Court, and Misrepresentation, examines the media coverage of the Supreme Court, arguing that coverage has changed, and now the court and the justices are covered more similarly to other political institutions, to the detriment of the court and to the court's legitimacy. Professor Solberg is working on a number of exciting projects, and 2 that I've highlighted the last couple of times I've had the honor of introducing her have been a retrospective study of Obama's judicial nominees and the diversity of the bench after 8 years of his presidency, being more committed to trying to diversify the bench. And she's also studying questions of the issues related to female judicial candidates. So without further ado, Professor Rory Solberg.
First, I want to thank Chris for inviting me to participate in our Constitution Day event, and also to thank Professor Boyte for taking additional time to join us. And I have to say, I only got the memo about 8 minutes. I didn't hear about this extra 4, so I'm trying to keep. And I will say we also had some emails about how expansive this topic is and how do you focus in when you sort of expect the next day is going to be some major event that will change whatever it is you want to talk about. So given the 8-minute limit, my remarks will be somewhat cursory, but hopefully they will spark some conversation. As Chris noted, my wheelhouse includes the judiciary. I'm a scholar and student of judicial politics. So I'm going to focus on that area and sort of in the era of Trump. And I'll start my conclusion with a, what I consider to be a fairly bad metaphor. That the judiciary has thus far weathered the political storm known as Trump. But there is no guarantee that all of the sort of small holes that have been consistently inflicted into the courts and the judiciary won't eventually sink that particular ship. So the first thing I should note, given the historical nature of the panel and sort of looking back, is that the judiciary, whether most people know it or not, has been in crisis for the entirety of the 21st century. And I fear that this continued crisis now has a new aspect that may hurt the judiciary on a basic level. As Chris noted, the previous book that I wrote with Professor Waltenberg, who is with us today and on sabbatical here, we're concerned about the legitimacy of the courts. And I'm more concerned about this particular aspect than I even am in terms of the media and its changing coverage. Judicial confirmations have become these political footballs that both sides of the aisles play with. They're both playing games. They're using different strategies to achieve the same ends. Empty seats on the lower courts, quite frankly. Republicans blocked Clinton's nominees, then Democrats blocked George W. Bush's nominees, and then Republicans blocked Obama's nominees. With each subsequent president, the levels of obstruction increase, and the issue, it's been lamented by judges, it's been lamented by scholars for years, but it kind of broke through to the public really when the politics of obstruction went prime time, and they did so in February of 2016 with the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia died. President Obama, as per his appointment power in Article 2, names a successor. And quite frankly, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, using a variety of arguments and many tactics, simply refused to give his nominee the time of day. Right? There was none of the normal meetings, there were no hearings, and the seat remained empty for the remainder of the October 2015 term and through the almost entirety of the October 2016 term. So that seat remained empty for over 400 days. This is unprecedented in terms of the Supreme Court. Not of the lower courts, but for the Supreme Court. Once President Trump was inaugurated, he named a successor quite quickly for Justice Scalia's seat. The GOP in the Senate immediately went into confirmation mode, held their meetings and their hearings, but not without resorting for the second time to a norm-breaking nuclear option of getting rid of the filibuster on nominations. Now, originally, the filibuster was nuked by the Democrats, attempting to be able to get some of President Obama's nominees through because of that high level of obstruction. But they maintained the option for the minority on the Supreme Court. So that they only nuked it for the lower court, so to speak. But even with a majority, the GOP in the Senate could not guarantee confirmation. They could not guarantee 60 votes. So they simply got rid of it for the Supreme Court. So now a bare majority of senators and a like-minded president can pack the courts in a way that they have not been able to do so historically. There is still one tactic that remains on the lower courts for the minority, but according to reports late last week, that tactic, which is often called the blue slip, and I can answer questions about that, is now also on the chopping block and is likely to be gone before much longer. So, this is a bit of concern, but my main point in recounting these events is that the public fight over filling the seat of Justice Scalia and the obvious political machinations, the obvious sort of flip-flops in views on both sides of the aisle here, in my view, seriously undercut the legitimacy of the court by making it patently obvious how political the Senate considers the staffing of the judiciary. And I think this was, again, in a way, much more so than we had seen before. Now, the judiciary may be able to handle this type of blow to its reservoir of legitimacy or its public reservoir of goodwill. After all, we saw the Supreme Court wade into a little bit of a political fight in 2000, deciding an election. And that, self-inflicted blow didn't undermine the court's legitimacy with the public. At least most scholars agree in terms of studies that came afterwards. And in this particular politicking that we've seen lately, the courts are sort of the ball, not the players, right? They weren't making these decisions. They're not asking to be blocked and to be, have empty seats and harder workloads. But this is all occurring at the same time that we have a president that tends to put it mildly, generate conflict. And those conflicts end up before the judges. His tendencies to tweet and the media's tendency to report any and all of his tweets mean that all of these conflicts, all of these wins and losses are out before the public in a way that the work of the courts have rarely been before. The tenor of the tweets, the lack of respect for the rule of law and federal judges is also quite different. Usually criticism sounds something like this, and here we'll do all my bad impressions. With all due respect to due deference to the separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests. Okay, this is Obama during his 2010 State of the Union. Not a very good Obama, I know, but you get what you get when you pay for, you know. George W. Bush said, we'll abide by the court's decision. That doesn't mean I have to agree with it, right? He's talking about some of the decisions dealing with detainees. And Al Gore said in his concession speech in 2000, now the US Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with this court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, right? Those are the kinds of criticism, very oblique and respectful, that we have seen from players at this level. It was bad enough when we had candidate Trump undercut judges like US District Court Judge Gonzalo Curiel, based solely on an assumption about his heritage. Curiel was the judge on a pair of cases charging Mr. Trump with essentially fraud, and Mr. Trump stated that the judge couldn't be fair because he was of, quote, Mexican heritage. Right now, as president, Mr. Trump takes to Twitter to belittle the decisions of federal judges and the judges themselves when he doesn't win in court. And it means something else now that he is no longer candidate Trump, and he is President Trump. He is the embodiment, as Professor Nichols mentioned so clearly. He calls them so-called judges, as if somehow by saying that you've taken away the fact that they were duly appointed and confirmed, and undercutting that legitimacy. He publicly noted that courts seem to be so political, and it would be so great for our justice system if they would be able to read a statement and do what's right. And that has to do with the security of our country, as if, again, what the courts have done. That's very different with all due deference. I disagree, right? You're saying that they can't do their job, they can't read a clear statement. He calls judicial orders outrageous when they go against him. So here we have the leader of one branch of government fostering and fomenting distrust in the only branch of government thus far willing to check his power. And it is the only branch of government that relies so heavily on the trust and compliance of the nation and politicians to sort of, ensure that that three-legged stool that we have of democracy, remains stable. So, we need to ensure that the court has the gravitas that it's had in the past to be able to check the executive power. So each time the president takes a swipe at the courts, takes a swipe at the judges, that stool that we have teeters. Each time he suggests or makes a blatantly unconstitutional policy, he forces the courts into this unwinnable game, right? Again, the travel ban, pretty clear that there's some issues, particularly with the first version of it. I don't know if you recall, but during the campaign and soon after, I think even after inauguration, he started talking about criminalizing flag burning, which is unconstitutional. Criminalizing the procurement of abortions, which at this point is unconstitutional. And he makes these statements over and over again that if these become policies, writes those in, that's going to immediately be challenged before court, right? So by not vetting these things beforehand, pushes them there. So one question remaining then is how many of these types of hits or cuts can the judiciary sustain? Will the judiciary sort of die from 1,000 small little cuts? The last major court presidential conflict that threatened the very institution of the judiciary, I would say, would go back to FDR versus the Four Horsemen, leading to FDR's famous court packing plan. Now, the court was able to save itself there by essentially altering its decision-making quite dramatically. Historical polls show that the plan was not particularly popular, so it's unclear how successful FDR could have been with that. But even that conflict was clothed in respectful discourse about the workload of the court and the continuing capacity of our aging jurists. Trump's attacks are neither so oblique or tactical. They seem to be visceral and immediate tweet storms to judicial losses that he then broadcasts to the public. Another question is whether the judiciary in our current political environment could replenish its reservoir of goodwill, right? Does it have the capacity to make the comeback? And what would it take? With growing distrust of the media, the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, are going to have a harder time. The media research shows generally tends to show respect and deference for federal judges, for federal courts, particularly those reporters that cover the courts exclusively. But the same tactics that the president has used against the courts, he uses only more so against the media. So the one of the institutions that could help the courts sort of rebuild that trust and legitimacy so they can have that gravitas, so that they can ensure our compliance and our goodwill when they then check the president, is also being undermined by the very same actor. So these seem to me to be pretty big problems. I have no answers to these dilemmas either. I just bring them to you on Constitution Day for discussion. If I'm not incorrect, I think it's probably about my 8 minutes.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Solberg. Part of our challenge is to raise the unanswerable questions about the Constitution and the President. All right, so second up is Associate Professor of Political Science in the School of Public Policy here at Oregon State, David Bernell. He is also director of OSU's Master's in Interdisciplinary Studies degree program. Professor Bernell has worked in government, actually for the Office of Management and Budget and Department of Interior, and is interested in considering some thought experiments related to the presidency and the Constitution. His research is largely focused on environmental and foreign affairs, including essays and articles on ethanol and on environmental disclosure in China. And Professor Bernell's books include Constructing U.S. Foreign Policy, The Curious Case of Cuba, and Readings in American Foreign Policy, the former from Rutledge and the latter from Longman. So without further ado, Professor Bernell.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris was saying, before I came here to OSU, I worked for the federal government. I had a political appointment with the Clinton administration. And so, you know, as Will Rogers said, right, I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And so, you know, I'm a professor of political science in Oregon, right? You know what I'm thinking already, even if I didn't tell you I worked for President Clinton. Because I was there during the Clinton administration. And I got there about a week after everybody learned the name Monica Lewinsky. So that was the environment in which I was working. So you know where I stand. Like the people that I'm hanging around with on election night, could this possibly be true? How has this happened? So that's where I come at this personally. But in terms of thinking about this as a in political science, I was thinking about this as kind of an experiment for thinking about what's going on here. And my sense is that the Trump presidency is really a fascinating experiment that's going on right now. I don't think there's ever been anyone, or will be someone in the Oval Office with less integrity or less, intelligence or preparation for the office. Just in a number of ways, I just don't hold the man in great high esteem. But the presidency is much larger than the president, right? It includes all kinds of people in the White House and the White House staff, in the executive office of the president, and in the entire executive branch, right? So the reach is pretty far, and there's a lot to what the presidency tends to involve and what it touches. And my thought is that in terms of thinking about this as an experiment, if Trump can't shake up American institutions, then nobody can, right? Or maybe the other side of thinking about it is this, which is, if the president can run roughshod over opponents, disregard the law, get away with it, violate the norms of democracy with some kind of lasting effect, and we're not going to know about that for a while. If you can do all of these things, then maybe the Constitution and American political institutions aren't nearly as resilient as we think or we had hoped. But on the other hand, on the other side, if the pushback is somewhat successful in blocking him, then maybe it's the case that our institutions, our Constitution, our political culture are pretty strong, right? In other words, just how resilient or resistant to change is the government, is our system of governance here. So I was thinking, well, what's the problem, right? What's the worst that could happen? And in thinking about this in terms of the Constitution, right? We're looking at Article 2 here, which is pretty vague. It just gives these broad contours of what the presidency actually is and does. And because of that, the value of precedent and the value of what somebody actually does in office really ends up characterizing what the office becomes and what it's capable of doing. And of course, in response to all kinds of changes in society, in terms of the values and the norms that we expect our government to embody and the things we expect it to do for us, and of course, a changing world has really allowed the presidency to grow into this huge, really massive institution that people wouldn't have foreseen when they developed this Constitution. The president's got control of the bully pulpit, right? There's this ability to set the national agenda, has regulatory power, has discretion over the enforcement and implementation of law and policy, control of federal law enforcement, control of the national security apparatus, right? The list is huge of what the president is capable of doing. And what that also means in terms of thinking about the Constitution and what's the worst that could happen is that this office represents a great potential threat to our constitutional liberties and the way we've expected that democracy is going to work. And so the position is really flexible in that regard. And it's often defined by the person himself in the position, right? What's that person's character or competence and abilities, their integrity, their leadership skills, all of that tends to define the presidency in the absence of very strict kind of definitions provided in the Constitution. So again, let's go back and think, okay, what am I really worried about here? And I was reading an article recently, and the guy was saying, I was trying to think of all these terrible things, and I couldn't find what was distinct about Trump when I was thinking about this. And he said, what are these worrisome things that an anti-democratic president might do? Use the presidential power to bully corporations around? Well, Truman did that. Distort or exaggerate facts to initiate or escalate a war? Johnson did that. George W. Bush did that. Lie point blank to the public? Well, they all do that. Defy orders from the Supreme Court? Andrew Jackson, Lincoln did that. Suspend habeas corpus? Lincoln was on that one too. Spy on American activists? Kennedy, Johnson certainly did that. Nixon. Start wars at will without congressional approval? Truman, Reagan, we got just about everybody in the post-war era. Incarcerate U.S. citizens of foreign extraction? FDR did this as much as anyone. Use covert operations to circumvent congressional restrictions? Well, there was Reagan and the whole Iran-Contra scandal. Assert sweeping powers to lock people up without trial or judicial review? George W. Bush did this, right? Declare an open-ended national emergency? Again, Bush. And Obama continued it. Kill U.S. citizens abroad? Obama did this as well. And of course, grant favors to political friends and make mischief for political enemies, again, everybody. So of all of these things that I'm worried about, that this one article was talking about, there's really good precedent in our history for doing all of these things, and yet I'm still left with this sense that there's something different here, right? I know that all of these specific things look like what other presidents have done in the past, But I'm still left with this sense that the current president has very little or maybe no respect for the institutions of American democracy or democracy itself. And that really what drives him is, I like the note here, it says all at once.
Do it all at the same time.
You get it all at once. But there's the sense, right, it's power, the need for applause that seem to really drive this president as much as anything. And Rory's good note here that we may get all these things at once. But I am left a sense that it's not just these particular transgressions, right? It's the person who could commit them. And again, it's because this office, the limitations on it and the contours of it are so vague and so ambiguous in the Constitution, and that it does come back to the person, right? The character or integrity or competence of that person. So in looking at the kind of hypotheticals, how bad can it be? I was thinking, well, let's take a look at what's actually gone on so far and see how good or bad this is, right? How much of my fears come true, right? And of course, I look at this, and I was working in environmental policy in the government when I was there, and I look at this and see a daily attempt to weaken environmental law, to weaken health and safety protections for people. And I look at this in all kinds of departments, right? Department of Interior, Health and Human Services, EPA. You can just look again and again and see these things that don't look so good. I see attacks on the courts and judges, on a weekly basis. Also the press. And I see, in an environment where, looking at Charlottesville and seeing people openly proclaim white supremacy and racism. People used to be ashamed of this, and rightly so, right? If they were going to express these kinds of opinions, they did it under a hood, or they posted things anonymously, right? You should bury this deep down inside and be ashamed of it and not want to do this in public. And now I see people doing these kinds of things and saying these things and proclaiming them more in public openly. And I see that environment, and I see a White House that's reacting to this in a way that just provides encouragement for this kind of thing. I see Muslims, I see immigrants, especially from the Middle East or from Mexico and Latin America being targeted as objects of hate and fear and derision. I see White House turnover and chaos. Right? And I was there, like I said, when Lewinsky was in the news every day, and we seem to have a pretty stable White House by comparison at the time. I see international crises, particularly regarding North Korea, get us all killed. There's just a lot that I look at and say, wow, this isn't so great. And yet I also see the reaction, and I wonder to what extent is the system working as intended, as posited by James Madison and the framers and the authors of the Federalist paper. And it may be the case that some of the checks and balances in the Constitution, some of the reaction from civil society, the courts, the press, bureaucracy, the public, even Congress to some extent, are putting some blocks on this president. With the immigration order that came out, within the first week of the presidency, Trump had talked about how a so-called judge was endangering national security, as you had pointed out. But one of the interesting things that came up at the time when the order had been blocked, and there was chaos in the airports, and lawyers were running around saying, we'll represent you for free, things like that. There was this question, is the president just going to tell Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs and all this stuff to just ignore the ruling and just do what you're doing anyway? And there was this question, will he defy the court order? And people didn't know the answer until the president provided the answer. And the answer was, no, they wouldn't defy the court order. They said, what we will do is we will go back and rewrite the ban. We will challenge things in court rather than openly defy. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because the response from the White House was, we're going to go through the courts to do this. We're going to issue another executive order. Didn't mean I liked it, doesn't mean that the system was perfect, but there was a pushback, and instead of trying to run roughshod over it, the White House said, okay, we're going to do this in the way that we tend to conduct business in this country through the courts. On the investigation about the campaign's possible collusion with Russia, of course the president's attacked everyone, including his own attorney general. He fired James Comey, he's tweeting endlessly, and at the same time I look at this and think, to to some extent, the institutions and rules seem to be working as intended, right? His own Attorney General, who was being attacked by the president, said, I will recuse myself from the investigation, which would be a norm that we would expect to be respected in that way. And the Deputy Attorney General appointed a special counsel, right? So we've got Robert Mueller looking into this and conducting an investigation. And the Justice Department has essentially protected that investigation and given it the resources to do its job. Thinking about the congressional investigation of this, those have proceeded with much less fanfare, except at the beginning, when it looked like the House investigation into all of this appeared to be just, cover for the president, that the chair of the committee was in Trump's pocket and they were just doing his bidding. And the public outcry that arose from that caused the chair of the committee to step aside as a result. And again, I'm looking at this and saying, is the system working as intended? Maybe not as completely foreseen that we would have this kind of situation, but is it working, right? The Senate's investigation, which again is kind of quietly happening, has been described as, particularly bipartisan in its efforts. Congress even went so far as to pass a law sanctioning Russia, placing sanctions against Russia to make sure that President Trump couldn't weaken the sanctions regime that was in place, and passed it with enough of a majority to make it so that even a veto could be overturned. So even Congress, in its own way, a GOP-controlled Congress, is pushing back sometimes against the White House and the president, and even 3 Republican senators who refused to, approve the repeal of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, were again saying we're willing to part ways with this president. I look at the bureaucracy and see some of the pushback there. Just a few weeks ago, the EPA leaked a report on climate change, and they wanted that draft to get out in the public before it could get vetted and perhaps edited or changed for political reasons when it went to the White House. So you've got kind of rogue agents, as it were, within the federal agencies saying we want to make sure that politics doesn't completely overwhelm policy here in this case. You might remember right at the beginning of the administration, there were these tweets that came out by these kind of rogue officials at the EPA, I think in the Department of the Interior, saying we're not going to let science get trashed under the Trump administration, and we're going to make sure that people know what's going on and that our missions aren't completely overwhelmed. Of course, the press has been pretty relentless in covering the administration and critiquing the administration, and they've even managed to develop some pretty interesting relationships with people not just in the executive agencies, but in the White House, who are leaking all kinds of things. So everything from even the details of conversations with foreign leaders that the president is having are getting leaked because people within the White House are talking to the press and allowing some of these things to get exposed. So in conclusion, what I might say is that this experiment looks pretty interesting to me, and I don't want to give President Trump credit for anything because that would just go against my partisan tendencies. But he does seem to be reinvigorating the checks and the avenues to challenge a sitting president and to kind of reinvigorate our appreciation for these checks and balances as well. So it's not necessarily optimism, but a sense that things aren't as bad as I feared they might be at this point. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Professor Bernell. All right, last but far from least is our cleanup batter on this panel, our honored University Today speaker, Harry Boyte, who's the senior scholar in public work philosophy at the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship at Augsburg University. He's the architect of the center's public work approach to civic engagement and democracy, and the creator of Public Achievement. Boyte has worked with a variety of foundations, nonprofits, educational and citizen organizations in the U.S. and abroad, concerned primarily with community development, citizenship, education, and civic renewal. Boyte serves as senior advisor to the National Commission on Civic Renewal and presented research findings at Camp David seminar on the future of democracy. among other such engagements. He's the author of 9 books on citizenship, democracy, community organizing. His writings have appeared extensively, more than 100 publications that I can't summarize here. New York Times, Perspectives on Politics, Wall Street Journal, etc. In the 60s, he worked for and with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as a field secretary with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement, among other claims to fame. So thank you so much, Harry, for joining us, and the floor is now yours for 8 to 12 minutes.
Well, look, I was a lowly field secretary with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So I used to drive King to the airport. My dad was on the executive committee, so I did hear internal discussions of the strategy of the movement. So I have a different area, which is the point of view of citizens. I have the point of view of government. Obviously, government is.
Yeah,
can you
it's
not
a
hear?
little hard to hear back here. Sorry.
Okay, I'll increase my volume.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I said my perspective is what could be called seeing like a citizen, not seeing like a state or a government. So what does this look like from the point of view of someone who, from the very beginning of my career, thought about democracy in a different way, thought about citizenship in a different way, thought about politics in a different way. The way I learned as a kid in the movement. So it looks different, frankly. For one thing, we can't look to government to fix things. No branch of government to fix things. Not in American political culture. It's up to us. The song of the citizenship schools, which I worked for as a young man, was "We are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody is going to rescue us." And then we would say, "We are the ones, we are the ones. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for." And then, sing. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. The next verse will be, nobody else gonna rescue us.
Nobody else gonna rescue us.
We are the ones.
We are the ones
we've been waiting for. So there is going to be a new voice, and I know this presence well, because I was brought into the Obama campaign in 2008 to put together a civic committee. And our framework of the civic committee was government is not the center of democracy. That was interesting. Axelrod, Weisberg, and people who brought me in wanted that voice, right? My mentors in the movement, people like Septimer Clark, who directed the citizenship school movement that I worked for, hundreds of schools across the South, had studied the Constitution, by the way. There was a big document, as well as the Declaration of Independence, and it was partly literacy, and it was partly to study it, and partly to... Septimer said, what is the point of the movement? Well, obviously, it's to get full civil rights for African Americans, Black Americans, but that's actually not the deepest goal of the movement. The deepest goal of the movement is to, the exact quote, broaden the scope of democracy to include everyone, and deepen the concept of democracy to include every relationship. So this was democracy as a way of life. Vincent Harding, who was a speechwriter and a very close colleague of King and a good friend of my dad's, put it, the civil rights movement was in fact a powerful outcropping of the continuing struggle for the expansion of democracy. It demonstrates the deep yearning for a democratic experience that is far more than periodic voting. Now, in fact, if you read Obama's speeches in the 2008 campaign, he said something pretty much like this every speech. And as Peter Levine, who studied the speeches and study the media responses to the speeches shows irrefutably that message was either completely ignored or treated with contempt by the political establishment. Now there's a history here. The history is rooted in the constitutional period. So here I draw from the work of the political theorist Sheldon Wolin, who wrote a series of articles in the late 1970s. The most important one was State of the Union, who showed that Lincoln's famous formulation of government of the people, by the people, and for the people had been slightly edited by Jimmy Carter, who talked about the great distrust that was developing between the people and government and said, everyone knows what the role of government is, it should be for the people. So, two phrases omitted from Carter's definition of American democracy. Wolin points out that the distinctive feature of the American founding political culture, and he doesn't say this, but my own argument and research is that it comes out of the experience of building communities, of authoring local governments, and also creating the civic and public goods, not handed down from antiquity or from the nobility, but actually things that citizens created, like schools and community centers and roads and bridges and wells, commons, the Commonwealth. The American founding moment introduced a different conception into modern politics, which is that government derives its authority from the people. As Wolin put it in the 1978 article on State of the Union on Jimmy Carter's, it was Carter, did I say Clinton? I mean Carter. Carter's presidency. The concept of the founding moment expressed in the Declaration of Independence especially, but also in the preamble of the Constitution, was that people constitute government as one way to do our work. So government doesn't precede the people precede the government. And as Wolin wrote later in his book on Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, Tocqueville Between Two Worlds, it was distinctive to imagine that politics is constituted in any society prior to a particular form of government. And that, of course, is what Tocqueville wrote. He wrote that, to his amazement, as a Frenchman, people self-organized in the United States to take on initiatives that in Europe would be taken. They would petition the king or the government to do for them. And he focused on the associational world, and so did Sheldon Wolin. But our interest in politics and the democracy has been the idea that it's not only associational life. People often felt themselves to be citizens through their actual work as teachers, as faculty. In fact, in the movement, the citizenship schools, these empowering grassroots schools where people learn literacy, they studied the Constitution. They learned nonviolence, not as a tactic, but as a philosophy. Called a part of it an epistemology of what I would call public love. King called it agape, but the ability to respect people who you may think are profoundly wrong and you may think of as your enemies. Respect their potential. But the citizenship schools were often held in beauty parlors. And the key to that were beauticians who saw themselves as citizens. So beauticians organized all across the South to strengthen the citizenship dimension of their work as community centers, as public, as teaching people civic skills and empowerment. And all of this was embodied even in the marches. So in the literature on the movement, there is a distinction, which is useful and I'll get to, between the mobilizing wing of the movement, which is what people think about. It's the great marches, it's the sit-ins, it's the freedom rides, the visible expression of protest, but actually the foundation of the movement were the grassroots organizing efforts that came out of things like the citizenship schools, where people learned how to solve problems, developed a sense of agency in the world, that got out of the thumb of the local plantation guy, learned how to read so they could, decipher the tax codes, a lot of ways. And the sensibility that developed was, we are the ones we've been looking for. You want politics. In fact, I remember as a kid, sending off, before I could vote, 1964, to the janitor who was Oliver Harvey, leading an organizing campaign in Duke. And I sat with fire and bravado and silliness of an 18-year-old. I'm not going to vote in the election even if I could. I couldn't. Johnson won't desegregate the South. Mr. Harvey looked at me with some tolerance, I guess you could say. He was a great intellectual. And said, he taught me about the movement for decades and history and the architecture of Durham and the blues traditions and the organizing in the 30s. Anyway, he said, Harry, that's a ridiculous thing to say. He said, no president or no politician is going to desegregate the South. What do you think the movement is about? The movement is going to desegregate the South, but it does make a difference who's in office. And then he just rattled off. Appointment powers, media coverage, federal marshals, the ability to pass legislation. But he said, they're not going to do it for us. This is our work. So our calculation should be, who can we work with most effectively to advance the work of the people in bringing a deeper democracy? So that's how I've thought about this ever since. Now, interestingly, I don't think it's simply right-wing neoliberalism that's been the problem. I do think that the market has spread wildly, and there is a kind of history behind that. But I think actually technocratic, progressive politics has played an important and destructive role, and even forms of citizen action. So in the movement, there was a deep sense that the people are making change. You get a little glimpse of that in the Selma movement, but you don't really get the citizenship schools. You get the dignity and the power of the people. But and it was tremendous power. But the fact is that the sites in the life of communities, from beauticians to churches to schools to colleges, that once created places for people to develop a sense of agency, have been technicized. They've become centers, which are service centers for delivering goods to people conceived as clients and customers, and that's the way higher education trains people. So no longer do we have any, in fact, every professional association, even the most committed to collaborative work and citizen empowerment and all that kind of rhetoric, they never talk about themselves as citizens. They talk about themselves as working with citizens. So that's a sentimentalization and in a way a marginalization of citizens. And I could give powerful stories about that, but I don't have time enough. 2 minutes left. Let me just note a couple of things. So there is the subterranean memory that, according to the Jeffersonian, Paine, Benjamin Franklin wing of the founding, as Jefferson said, the only safe repository of the powers of the republic are the people themselves. Or, if people are governors of their affairs every day, not simply one day a year on election day, they will sooner let the heart be torn from their body than be dictated to by some Caesar or some Bonaparte. Madison took a very different view. In Federalist Paper 10, and so did the Federalists, they argued that give to the elected body of citizens the power to decide, and they will exercise power with virtue. So I think that's a little tarnished. But basically the point is that there's always a kind of interaction and a chemistry and a culture of democracy which is much bigger than democracy as government. Even though in the literature, and I would say the scholarly literature, there's been a remarkable shrinking of democracy over the last 20 years, including the scholarly literature. So just look at the writings of the distinguished, well-known political scientist Robert Putnam. first well-known book, Making Democracy Work, was about Italian regional governments, and what he found, and he argued, was that his research, and there's where he had a team, their research showed the effectiveness of government depends entirely on the vitality of civic life. And he defined it in associational terms. He had an associational lens, not a work lens. His last book, Our Kids, Growing Inequality, he defines the government, he defines democracy. He goes right to Robert Dow and says what matters in democracy is what happens in government. A radical shrinking in Robert Putnam's own understanding of government, of democracy. I could go through the American Political Science Task Force on inequality in democracy. Even the great, he's a great friend of mine, we worked on this Clinton project together. Benjamin Barber was on that task force. They was Scotch poll appointed it. They defined government as the center of democracy. So every activity that they define as citizen activity is focused on government. No other activities are defined as part of the democratic system in that task force report. Now, I think we have a problem. We've seen an erosion of people's sense of agency and power and authority and confidence. There's a tremendous problem in the political establishment. We did this project for 2 years with the Clinton White House from 93 to 95 around reinventing citizenship. We found all sorts of continuing parts of federal agencies like the EPA, which had a more partnership approach. We were fighting the new public management, which was defining citizens as customers. That was the big obstacle, and that was the bigger force. We lost the battle. But we did win in the Clinton's State of the Union in 1995 after the Democratic collapse. Bill Galston, who was domestic policy advisor, got Clinton to agree to a Camp David meeting arguing that something's changing deeply in America. Ben Barber and I were there. Putnam was there. It was actually kind of schools of different political thought. Scotch full of kind of New Deal, Alan Wolf. So there were actually 4 different camps. The New Democrats. They wasn't billed that way, but that's what it was. But actually Clinton liked the idea that we needed to recall the concept that the citizens are at the center of democracy. The State of the Union, read the State of the Union in 1995. That was the point of the State of the Union. He said government is a partner with citizens, but the genius of American democracy is not what government does, it's people working and get together across partisan lines. And E.J. Dionne, the next day I talked to him, he was working for the Washington Post then. He said, well, we've been polling overnight, people are puzzled by this, and presidents don't talk this way, maybe since Roosevelt they did sometimes. Kennedy sentimentalized citizenship. He said we should serve the country, but it was sentimental. But E.J. said correctly, he made a prediction. He said this won't last because Washington thinks Clinton has gone crazy. This is not a message. And E.J. added, this will never take hold as a theme in American politics again until people ask for it. It's going to have to be the citizenry that redefines democracy. And I think that's our role. Now I would add, since I know this world, that Obama, who believes in a citizenship message in politics, and kept saying during the election in 2008, once I get in office, I can actually do very little. And adopted what I thought, there were some positives, but I thought overall in terms of democracy, it was a pretty standard liberal technocratic approach. Kind of moderate, progressive, technocratic approach. It was not a citizen approach. The place that came out was in his speeches. So if you look at his speeches, there's like a two world. It's kind of a bizarre contrast between Obama's speeches, including his State of the Unions and his nomination speeches, and his first and second inaugural speeches, and his policies. But the Obama Foundation has the mission of joining in an effort to revitalize the citizenship movement in America. So that's a very promising sign. Thank you.